In the winter of 1897, Boston believed it had mastered the laws of intelligence. They believed brilliance could be measured, ranked, explained. They believed genius had a color. Then a 13-year-old black girl solved a problem that shattered every rule they had written. What followed was not admiration, it was fear. And fear, when protected by science and power, becomes something far more dangerous than ignorance. Boston, 1897, wore its confidence like a well-tailored coat, heavy with certainty and stitched together by men who believed the world could be explained if measured carefully enough. And on that particular winter evening, the city's streets glistened under lamplight as snow pressed itself into the seams of brick and stone, muffling sound and sharpening thought, while inside the lecture halls near Cambridge, the air smelled of chalk dust, coal smoke, and intellectual pride. Because this was a place that believed it had mapped the boundaries of human potential, believed intelligence followed laws as predictable as gravity, believed genius could be sorted, ranked, and assigned according to skull size, lineage and color. And in these rooms, men spoke confidently about natural limits, while diagrams of cranial measurements hung like commandments on the walls, never imagining that the most dangerous contradiction to their worldview was waiting quietly in the hallway, a 13-year-old black girl named Lydia Johnson, whose mother scrubbed those same halls clean after lectures ended, whose presence was meant to be invisible, whose footsteps were expected to fade into the background of history without leaving an imprint. And yet on that night, Lydia lingered longer than usual, not out of rebellion but curiosity, standing before a chalkboard still marked with half-erased symbols from Professor Harrison Webb's Advanced Mathematics Seminar, symbols that fascinated her in the way constellations fascinate those who have never been told they are allowed to look up. And Lydia copied them slowly, carefully, not knowing their formal names but sensing their logic, their balance, the way they seemed to speak to one another across the board. And when she noticed an inconsistency, a gap where the equation refused to resolve itself, she did not hesitate, because hesitation was a luxury for those afraid of being wrong, and she had already learned that the world expected nothing from her. So she completed the problem in a way that felt natural, inevitable, and when Professor Webb returned unexpectedly to retrieve a forgotten notebook and saw his own work finished in a handwriting that was not his first response was laughter, the indulgent chuckle of a man amused by what he assumed was a child's mimicry, until he checked the numbers, until he followed the logic line by line and felt something cold bloom behind his ribs, because the solution was not only correct, it was elegant, more efficient than his own approach. And in that instant, the room shifted, the walls seeming to press inward as the implications settled, because Lydia Johnson had not merely solved a problem, she had solved a problem that had resisted men trained at the highest levels, men whose authority rested on the assumption that minds like hers were incapable of such abstraction. And Lydia stood there silently, watching his face change, not with pride, but with unease, because even without understanding the language of racial theory, she understood fear when she saw it, understood that the look in his eyes was not admiration but alarm. And Webb, to his credit or his curse, did not shout or accuse or dismiss her outright, but neither did he celebrate, because celebration would require acknowledging what her brilliance meant. And so he did what institutions often do when confronted with inconvenient truth. He reframed it, calling her an anomaly, a word that made the impossible sound manageable. And he asked her questions that were not questions at all. How long had she been watching lectures? Who had taught her? Whether someone had coached her? And Lydia answered honestly, explaining that no one had taught her, that she listened, that numbers made sense to her in a way words sometimes did not, and each answer deepened the problem rather than resolved it, because it stripped away every explanation that would have preserved the hierarchy he lived within. And by the time he escorted her out into the cold night, telling her she might return to learn more, his mind was already racing ahead, not toward opportunity, but toward containment, because a discovery like Lydia Johnson could not simply be shared, not yet, not without risk, and word traveled quickly among men who believed themselves guardians of knowledge, whispers moving through faculty lounges and private offices about a Negro girl whose mind did not fit the charts, And those whispers carried not excitement but dread, because if Lydia's intelligence were acknowledged openly, it would call into question decades of published work, undermine theories that justified social order, and threaten careers built on the premise of biological hierarchy. And so the language around her shifted almost immediately, her name appearing in notes alongside words like case, outlier, specimen terms that stripped her of personhood and transformed her into a problem to be solved. And Lydia, still a child, sensed the change without fully understanding it, sensing that the invitation to return was not a gift but a summons, sensing that the halls she had once wandered freely now watched her back. And when she told her mother about the professor's interest, her mother felt a flicker of pride quickly smothered by fear. Because black parents in 1897 understood something no textbook would ever teach, that attention from powerful white men was rarely benign, and yet refusal was not an option offered to people like them. And so Lydia returned, stepping back into those halls where curiosity curdled into scrutiny, where questions multiplied and smiles thinned, where her mind was tested again and again under the guise of encouragement, each correct answer tightening the invisible net around her, because with every demonstration of brilliance she erased another excuse the institution might have used to dismiss her. And by the end of that first week, Professor Webb knew what he could not yet admit aloud. Lydia Johnson was not an exception that proved the rule. She was evidence that the rule itself was a lie, and lies that large do not fall quietly. They are defended, protected, and when necessary, buried. And before we go any further into what that defense looked like, before we descend into the choices that transformed admiration into horror, subscribe to the Black Timeline, hit the bell icon, and stay with us until the end. And when this story is over, leave a comment telling us how deeply it affected you, because stories like Lydia Johnson's were not lost by accident. They were erased, and remembering them is the first step toward refusing that erasure. In the days that followed Lydia Johnson's quiet entrance into the attention of Boston's academic elite, the atmosphere around her shifted so subtly that even those causing it might have denied it was happening at all. Because institutions rarely announce when they decide to protect themselves, they simply begin to rearrange reality to suit their needs, and Lydia felt this rearrangement in the way her name was spoken, less often aloud and more often behind doors, in the way Professor Webb's questions grew narrower and more repetitive, circling the same concepts, as if hoping to catch her in an error that would restore balance. And when that error never came, when she continued to answer with the same calm certainty, her intelligence began to be described not as brilliance, but as peculiarity, a small but crucial shift in language that allowed admiration to harden into suspicion. And soon other men appeared at the back of the lecture room when Lydia was called in to solve problems. Men she had never seen before, men with notebooks who did not introduce themselves, who watched her hands as she wrote, her posture as she thought, her face as if it might betray some hidden trick. And Lydia, still 13, still slight, still dressed in the plain clothing of a cleaner's daughter, became acutely aware that her body was being examined as carefully as her mind, that her thoughts were no longer enough on their own, and that whatever she represented frightened these men in a way they could not admit, because fear has a way of disguising itself as professionalism. And so they told themselves they were being thorough, objective, scientific, and Lydia overheard fragments of conversation not meant for her ears, phrases like untrained cognition, atavistic mimicry, statistical impossibility, words that meant nothing to her individually, but carried a tone she recognized, the tone adults use when they have already decided something and are only gathering language to justify it. And Professor Webb, who had once looked at her with startled wonder, now seemed divided within himself, torn between the truth his eyes could not deny and the world his career depended on. Because to champion Lydia openly would be to invite ridicule at best and professional exile at worst, and the other professors were quick to remind him of this in private, suggesting that perhaps the girl had memorized solutions, that perhaps she had been coached by some unknown benefactor, that perhaps the tests themselves were flawed. And when each of these explanations collapsed under scrutiny, the final refuge became Lydia herself, the idea that something about her was unnatural, not in the mystical sense, but in the clinical one. A deviation to be studied rather than a person to be supported, and so the sessions grew longer. Stretching into evenings, Lydia sitting beneath gaslight as equations were placed before her with increasing complexity, her mind leaping eagerly even as her body grew tired, because she loved the work, loved the clarity of numbers in a world that otherwise spoke in riddles, and yet even that love could not shield her from the creeping realization that she was being isolated, separated from other children, from her mother's presence, from any environment where her answers might be celebrated without reservation, and when she asked innocently whether she might attend the school formally, whether she might learn more openly, the men exchanged glances before offering non-committal smiles, because education implied inclusion, and inclusion was precisely what they could not allow without unraveling the hierarchy that placed them above her, and so instead they offered observation, a word that sounded passive, but carried with it the weight of control. And Lydia's mother, noticing her daughter's exhaustion and the way she flinched at unfamiliar footsteps, confronted Professor Webb one evening, demanding to know what exactly was being done to her child. And Webb, caught between conscience and caution, spoke in reassurances that were technically true but morally hollow, promising that Lydia was safe, that she was being encouraged, that this attention might one day benefit her. And Lydia's mother, lacking the power to challenge him directly, left with unease heavy in her chest, the kind of unease born not of clear danger, but of too many unanswered questions, and as winter deepened, the scrutiny intensified, moving beyond mathematics into measurements that Lydia did not understand the purpose of, her head circumference noted, her reflexes tested, her eyesight examined under harsh light, all explained as routine, as necessary, as part of understanding her condition, and Lydia began to sense that what made her special in one room made her suspect in another, that the same men who marveled at her solutions spoke in hushed tones about what those solutions threatened to expose, and the company. Contradiction weighed on her in ways she could not articulate, because children understand more than they are given credit for, especially when their survival depends on reading the moods of adults, and Lydia learned quickly when to speak and when to remain silent, when to show enthusiasm and when to temper it, trying instinctively to make herself smaller, less disruptive, without dimming the light that numbers ignited inside her, and yet no amount of self-adjustment could resolve the fundamental problem she represented, because Lydia Johnson was living evidence that the world these men had constructed was incomplete, and incomplete worlds do not respond kindly to proof of their own falsehood, and so discussions began to take place in rooms Lydia would never enter, discussions framed as concern but rooted in preservation about how best to handle such a case, how to study it without publicizing it, how to extract knowledge without granting legitimacy, and it was in these conversations that the language shifted again, away from anomaly and toward opportunity, not opportunity for Lydia, but opportunity for science to examine, dissect, and explain away what it could not afford to accept at face value, and as these plans took shape, Lydia remained unaware of the full extent of what was being decided for her, sensing only that each correct answer pulled her deeper into a system that no longer felt like learning, and that the silence surrounding her work was not temporary, but intentional. A silence that pressed in on her from all sides, foreshadowing the truth she would soon be forced to confront. That brilliance, when it contradicts power, is rarely celebrated, and more often contained, categorized, and ultimately claimed by those who fear what it reveals. As the quiet containment around Lydia hardened into something more deliberate, the machinery that had been moving invisibly finally began to show its edges, and she felt it first, not through force but through absence, through the sudden narrowing of her world, because permissions that had once been assumed were now withheld without explanation, visits shortened, conversations redirected, and her mother informed, politely, firmly, that Lydia's sessions would now require more privacy for the sake of accuracy, a word that sounded harmless until it was paired with rules, and Lydia, still young enough to want to please, still trusting enough to believe that adults meant what they said, was ushered into rooms she had never seen before, rooms deeper within the institution, where windows were smaller, doors thicker, and the smell of chemicals lingered beneath the gaslight, and here the men who questioned her were no longer professors in the traditional sense but specialists, introduced with titles that meant little to her, men who spoke less about mathematics and more about mechanisms, asking her not only how she arrived at answers, but what she felt when she did, whether she heard numbers as sounds or saw them as shapes, whether patterns appeared unbidden in her mind, and Lydia answered honestly, describing the way equations unfolded for her like stories that simply wanted to be finished, unaware that every word was being transcribed not as testimony of genius, but as data to be filtered through theories that could not allow her brilliance to exist on its own terms. And the examinations grew more invasive, framed always as harmless, necessary routine, her pulse measured as she solved problems, her breathing observed, her eyes tracked as she followed lines of logic across the page, and when she faltered from fatigue, the faltering itself was noted, not as evidence of her humanity, but as potential weakness to be exploited, and she began to understand, dimly at first and then with growing clarity, that success no longer brought relief, that each correct solution tightened the net around her, because the goal was no longer to learn from her, but to locate the source of what they insisted could know. Simply be her mind, and outside those rooms, the institution began to prepare its justifications, papers drafted but never published, correspondences exchanged in coded language about controlled environments and protective custody, invoking concern for Lydia's well-being even as they discussed isolating her further, because concern, when wielded by power, is a remarkably flexible tool, and Lydia's mother, sensing that something fundamental had shifted, demanded answers again, only to be met with walls of authority she had no means to scale, told that her daughter was participating in important work, that interruptions could compromise outcomes, that resistance might jeopardize Lydia's future, and the cruelty of this logic lay in its plausibility, because it dressed coercion in the language of opportunity, and Lydia's mother, faced with men who controlled access, records, and law, was left with little choice but to trust a system that had never been designed to protect children like hers, and so Lydia remained day after day, her world shrinking to corridors and tables and the ever-present scratch of pencils on paper, her sense of time blurring as seasons passed outside without her, and within this narrowing world the questions shifted again, becoming more pointed, more revealing of the fear beneath them. Because now the men wanted to know not just how Lydia solved problems, but whether others like her existed, whether her family background held clues, whether her intellect could be replicated or, more importantly, explained away as aberration. And Lydia, sensing the trap, spoke carefully, minimizing herself instinctively. Yet even this self-erasure failed to soothe the anxiety she provoked, because her existence alone was enough, and so the institution's solution evolved from observation to containment, a subtle reclassification that allowed them to justify what came next, and Lydia noticed it in the paperwork she glimpsed, the way her name was now accompanied by numbers, case identifiers replacing personal references, and when she asked one of the assistants what they meant, he smiled thinly and told her it was just organization, just science being precise, but precision, she was learning, could be weaponized as easily as ignorance. And then came the day when she was asked to stay overnight for the first time, framed as a convenience, a way to continue work without interruption. And Lydia agreed, because she had been taught that cooperation was the safest path, and that night, lying on a narrow bed beneath unfamiliar shadows, she understood with a clarity that frightened, because it is false, but because it is too dangerous to be allowed to live openly. And as this realization settled, the story of Lydia Johnson shifted irrevocably, moving from discovery into disappearance, not yet complete, not yet visible to the world beyond those walls, but already unfolding with a momentum that would soon prove impossible to resist, carrying her toward a fate shaped less by what she could do than by what her brilliance exposed. And what it exposed was something the world of 1897 Boston was prepared to destroy in order to protect itself. By the time Lydia realized that disappearance does not always begin with vanishing but often with redefinition, the language around her had already changed so completely that there was no easy way back, because names had power and hers was being replaced piece by piece with labels that stripped her of childhood and agency, and the institution now referred to her presence not as participation, but as custody, a word that implied protection while quietly authorizing confinement. And Lydia felt this shift most sharply in the way doors no longer opened without escort, in the way her movements were charted with the same care as her thoughts, in the way even her sleep was monitored under the pretense of observation, and she began to understand that she was being kept not for what she might become, but for what she already threatened, because brilliance in a black child did not fit within the careful architecture of late 19th century American science, which depended on hierarchies presented as natural law, and Lydia's mind, precise and unyielding, unraveled those laws simply by existing. And so the men overseeing her case began to pursue a different goal, one that did not require her success, but rather her explanation, because if they could locate her intelligence in some abnormality, some defect, some deviation, then they could preserve the fiction that genius belonged elsewhere. And this pursuit took form in procedures that grew steadily colder, examinations that probed not her reasoning but her body, her skull measured and remeasured, calipers pressing against her temples while notes were taken in ink that would never record her discomfort, her reactions categorized as responses rather than emotions, and Lydia, lying still beneath their hands, learned the particular humiliation of being reduced to evidence against oneself, because every sign of intelligence was treated not as proof of humanity, but as a problem to be solved, and the men spoke around her as if she were not present, debating theories of inherited capacity, of racial limitation, of environmental mimicry, their words heavy with certainty and light on compassion, and Lydia began to withdraw inwardly, answering only what was asked, conserving energy, understanding instinctively that protest would be reinterpreted as pathology, because resistance itself could be labeled disorder. And outside those rooms, paperwork moved with terrifying efficiency, permissions signed, justifications drafted, courts consulted in ways that never involved Lydia's voice, because the law, like science, had learned how to cloak violence in procedure, and Lydia's mother, when she attempted again to intervene, was met not by professors but by administrators, men trained not to question morality but to manage outcomes, who assured her that everything being done was in Lydia's best interest, that her daughter was receiving care, that her future depended on continued cooperation, and the cruelty of this reassurance lay in its inversion of truth, because Lydia's future was precisely what was being narrowed, compressed into a case file that would follow her far longer than any equation she had solved, and within the institution, Lydia sensed a new urgency, a tightening of schedules, a sense that conclusions needed to be reached because prolonged uncertainty was dangerous, and she overheard whispers of publication, of reputations at stake, of critics, who must never learn the full extent of what had been observed, and she understood then that her fate was entangled not just with prejudice but with fear, because to acknowledge her openly would be to admit that decades of theory had been built on false premises, and powerful men rarely sacrificed their foundations willingly, and so the solution being shaped around her was one of containment rather than revelation, and the language used to justify it leaned heavily on benevolence, on protection, on the idea that the world was not ready for someone like Lydia, that exposure would harm her, and Lydia, hearing this, felt a bitter irony settle in her chest, because it was precisely their fear of exposure that endangered her, and as weeks blurred into months, the tests grew harsher, pushing her to exhaustion, deliberately introducing variables meant to break her consistency, to prove that her brilliance was fragile, conditional, unsustainable, and Lydia endured them with a quiet determination that went largely unnoticed, because resilience does not fit neatly into charts, and when she faltered from fatigue, when her answers slowed, the men nodded among themselves, satisfied, noting decline, ignoring the context they themselves had created, and it was during this period that Lydia first understood that survival and truth were not aligned goals in this place, that to protect herself might require diminishing herself, yet even as she attempted to dull her brilliance, to hesitate where once she had leapt, the instinct to solve remained, because her mind moved as it always had, and this persistence, only deepened the institution's resolve, because it suggested that her intelligence could not be easily extinguished, and so discussions turned darker, focusing on long-term solutions, on facilities better equipped for extended observation, on transferring Lydia somewhere less visible, where scrutiny could continue without interference. And Lydia, sensing the impending shift, felt a quiet panic take hold, not loud or dramatic, but cold and steady, the panic of understanding that one is being moved like an object rather than a person. And she thought of her mother, of the small home she barely remembered now, of the world outside the walls that continued without her, and she realized that disappearance was no longer a distant threat but an administrative outcome. And as the decision solidified, the men involved reassured themselves with the same narratives they had used from the beginning, that they were serving science, that progress required sacrifice, that Lydia's story would be preserved in data even if her voice was lost. And Lydia, sitting silently as plans were finalized around her, felt the weight of that erasure settling in, understanding with painful clarity that history often remembers conclusions without remembering the cost, and that her brilliance, once a source of wonder, had become an inconvenience to be managed. And as she was escorted one evening down a corridor she had never walked before, toward a door that marked the boundary between known and unknown, Lydia carried with her not just fear, but an unspoken truth that the institution could never fully erase, the truth that intelligence had flourished where it was not supposed, that knowledge had emerged from a body they had been taught to dismiss, and that no amount of containment could change the fact that, for a brief and dangerous moment, the world of 1897 Boston had been forced to confront the lie at its core, even if it chose, in the end, to bury that confrontation along with the child who embodied it. The transfer did not arrive with drama or announcement, but with paperwork and quiet efficiency, the most dangerous kind of movement because it leaves no moment for resistance. And Lydia was told only that she was being taken somewhere better suited to her needs, a phrase so vague it could hold anything. And she learned quickly that asking questions only delayed the inevitable without changing its direction, because the men escorting her did not see a child but a responsibility, a liability wrapped in intellectual promise. And as she was led through corridors she had never been allowed to walk before, past offices whose doors bore names she recognized from whispered conversations, she understood that this was not relocation but escalation, a movement from curiosity into control, and the carriage ride that followed felt unreal in its normalcy, Boston's streets passing by with their familiar sounds and smells, the city continuing as if nothing extraordinary were happening, as if a 13-year-old girl with a mind that had shaken academic certainty was not being quietly removed from its surface. And Lydia watched the world through the window with a strange detachment, aware that each block carried her further from the last place where her brilliance had been visible at all, even if it had been feared. And when they arrived, the building revealed itself not as a hospital or school, but as something in between, an institution designed to appear humane while functioning as a place of disappearance, its clean lines and orderly grounds masking the reality that those brought there rarely returned unchanged. And Lydia felt the finality of it settle in her bones as she crossed the threshold, because thresholds mark the moment when choice ends, and inside, the air smelled of antiseptic and damp stone, a smell that suggested both care and confinement, and she was introduced to new faces who spoke with the same careful politeness she had learned to distrust, men and women who referred to her as the subject, in conversations she was not meant to hear, who handled her records with reverence that did not extend to her person, and the routine established itself quickly, stripping away the last remnants of her former life, because here there were no visits, no letters passed without review, no familiar faces to anchor her sense of self, and the days became cycles of testing and observation that blurred together, her intelligence dissected piece by piece, not to understand it, but to locate its supposed flaw. And Lydia felt the weight of expectation shift, because where once she had been pressured to perform, now she was pressured to fail, subtly and persistently, as if her decline would validate everything they needed to believe. And when exhaustion dulled her responses, when hunger or isolation slowed her mind, those moments were seized upon eagerly, recorded as evidence, and Lydia began to see how science could be bent not toward truth but toward confirmation, because outcomes were shaped long before data was collected, and within this environment, Lydia's sense of time fractured, days stretching endlessly while months vanished without marker, and she clung to numbers as her only stable reality, solving equations in her head during long nights, tracing patterns on the walls, using mathematics as both refuge and rebellion because they could monitor her body but not fully contain her thoughts, and yet even this private resistance carried risk because when they discovered the extent of her continued mental activity, it only reinforced their belief that something within her was dangerously resilient, and discussions began again, this time about limits, about whether prolonged stimulation was harmful, about whether rest or enforced simplicity might normalize her. And Lydia listened from behind doors, understanding enough to know that normalization meant erasure, meant the dulling of what made her herself, and the cruelty of this realization lay in its familiarity, because black communities had long understood that survival often required shrinking, hiding excellence to avoid punishment. But Lydia was a child, and the burden of self-suppression pressed heavily on her, and still she endured, because endurance had become her only available strategy, and outside the institution, her absence began to calcify into SI. Lens, her name fading from conversation, her case discussed only in restricted circles, framed as unresolved, as ongoing, as requiring discretion, and Lydia's mother, when she tried once more to locate her daughter, encountered not hostility, but bureaucracy, a labyrinth of referrals and reassurances designed to exhaust rather than deny. And this exhaustion was itself a form of violence, because it relied on the assumption that persistence would eventually falter, and within the institution, Lydia sensed a turning point approaching, a shift from observation toward conclusion, because institutions cannot tolerate ambiguity indefinitely, and the men overseeing her case needed an ending that preserved their authority, and Lydia, increasingly withdrawn, increasingly aware of the narrative being built around her, felt a quiet clarity settle in, an understanding that her brilliance would not save her here, because salvation was never the goal, and as the tests grew less frequent, but more final in tone, as notes shifted from possibilities to determinations, Lydia realized that what was being decided was not just her future, but the story that would be told in her place, a story that would strip away her voice and replace it with theory, and this realization brought with it a strange calm, because fear thrives on uncertainty, and Lydia now understood the shape of the threat, even if she could not escape it, and she resolved, silently, to remember herself even if no one else would, to hold on to the truth of her mind as an act of defiance, because while they could confine her body and rewrite her story, they could not change the fact that she had existed, that she had solved what they could not, that she had forced a reckoning they chose to bury, and as she lay awake one night beneath institutional sheets, listening to the distant sounds of the building settling around her, Lydia Johnson understood that history often survives, not in records, but in absences, in the gaps where something vital has been removed, and that if her fate was to become such a gap, then the weight of that absence would carry its own testimony, waiting for a future willing to listen. As the institution settled into the rhythm of certainty, the kind that follows when decisions have already been made but not yet enacted, Lydia felt the temperature of her world change again, not in any dramatic way, but in the subtle withdrawal of curiosity, because curiosity implies possibility, and possibility was no longer permitted, and the staff who interacted with her now did so with the distant professionalism reserved for cases that had passed beyond debate, their questions fewer, their observations more procedural, as if her mind had already been mapped and categorized, its mystery reduced to footnotes, and Lydia understood that she had entered the most dangerous phase of all, the phase where no one was listening anymore, because when institutions stop asking questions, they begin enforcing conclusions, and those conclusions were written in a language that did not include her survival as a priority, and she sensed it in the way her schedule was altered, in the way certain tests were discontinued, not because they were unnecessary, but because their outcomes no longer mattered, and in their place came routines designed to diminish rather than discover, days structured to dull her focus, to interrupt her concentration, to impose a kind of mental stillness they referred to as rest, but which felt to Lydia like suffocation, and she resisted in the only ways available to her, retreating deeper into thought, replaying problems she had once solved, constructing new ones from memory, using the structure of mathematics to preserve a sense of order in a world that had become deliberately disordered. And this inward resistance sustained her for a time, but even that was noticed, because institutions trained to control bodies are quick to respond when the mind refuses to comply, and so new M.A. Shores were introduced, justified as therapeutic, sessions designed to redirect her attention, to simplify her thinking, to encourage what they called appropriate development, and Lydia listened to these phrases with a growing awareness that they were not meant to help her grow, but to bring her down to a level that felt safe to those observing her, because safety in this context meant invisibility, and the cruelty of this effort lay in its gradualness, because nothing was done suddenly enough to provoke outrage. Everything framed as incremental adjustment, as care, as protection. And Lydia learned how systems erase without leaving fingerprints, how they wear down resistance not through force alone but through repetition, through the steady insistence that compliance is normal and dissent is pathology, and she began to notice changes within herself, not in her intelligence but in her body's response to confinement, the way her thoughts sometimes scattered under fatigue, the way concentration required more effort, and she feared, quietly and intensely, that they might succeed not in disproving her brilliance but in exhausting it. And this fear sharpened her resolve, because Lydia understood instinctively that her mind was the last thing truly her own, and she guarded it fiercely, even as the world around her narrowed further, and outside the institution, the silence surrounding her case had deepened into absence, inquiries discouraged, records sealed under the language of confidentiality, her name appearing less and less even in internal correspondence, replaced by numerical identifiers that made it easier to forget she was a child at all, and this abstraction served a purpose, because it allowed those involved to proceed without confronting the moral weight of what they were doing, and Lydia felt this abstraction when she was spoken about in the third person while sitting in the room, when decisions were announced without explanation, when her reactions were noted without acknowledgement, and she learned that the most profound violence was not the procedures themselves but the erasure of recognition, the refusal to see her as someone to whom things were being done rather than something upon which experiments occurred. And as time stretched on, Lydia became acutely aware of how history was being shaped around her absence, because she overheard references to her case as resolved, as inconclusive, as a curiosity that had not yielded the disruptive answers some had feared, and she understood then that the institution had found its narrative, one that preserved its authority by minimizing her impact. And this realization brought with it a deep, quiet grief, not for herself alone, but for the truth that was being buried alongside her, the truth that brilliance had emerged where it was not allowed, and that rather than confront that fact, those in power had chosen to disappear it, and Lydia's thoughts turned often to her mother, to whether she still searched, whether she had been forced to accept the explanations offered, whether she carried the same questions Lydia carried now, and this imagined connection sustained her. A reminder that she had existed beyond these walls, that she had been loved not as a subject, but as a child, and as the institution moved toward what it considered closure, Lydia sensed that her presence was becoming inconvenient even within its confines, that prolonged containment risked questions, and that the final act of erasure would not be dramatic but administrative, a transfer, a reclassification, a quiet decision that would render her effectively unreachable, and this knowledge settled over her like a shadow, because it confirmed what she had long suspected, that there would be no moment of rescue, no recognition of error, no last-minute intervention, and yet within this bleak clarity, Lydia found a strange steadiness, because understanding stripped fear of its sharpest edge, and she resolved, silently, to remain herself as fully as possible for as long as possible, to think, to remember, to refuse the internalization of the lie being imposed upon her, because while they could dictate her circumstances, they could not rewrite the fact of her mind's existence, and as the days leading up to her final reassignment unfolded with bureaucratic inevitability, Lydia Johnson, 13 years old, brilliant beyond measure, understood with painful wisdom that history is often shaped not by what is discovered, but by what is deliberately forgotten, and that her life, reduced to silence, would become one of those forgotten truths, waiting for a future brave enough to listen to the echoes left behind. By the time the final reassignment arrived, it did so with the quiet inevitability of something long prepared, a decision that had been rehearsed in memos and meetings until it felt, to those making it, less like an act and more like a conclusion, and Lydia sensed it before anyone told her, sensed it in the way staff avoided her eyes, in the way her belongings were inventoried with impersonal care, in the way her name disappeared entirely from the few documents she was allowed to glimpse, replaced by codes that severed the last thread, tying her to an identity that existed beyond institutional walls. And when she was finally informed that she would be moved again, this time for her own good, the words landed without shock, because shock requires surprise, and Lydia had already grieved the idea of choice, and yet even in that numbness, a deeper awareness stirred, because she understood that this move was not about observation or treatment, but about resolution, about placing her somewhere so remote, so thoroughly obscured, that even the memory of her would fade into administrative dust. And as she prepared to leave the place that had already erased her once, Lydia felt a strange tension between fear and clarity, because clarity, once achieved, cannot be taken away. And she knew now exactly what she represented to the world that had confined her, not a child, not a prodigy, but a contradiction too dangerous to acknowledge, and the journey that followed unfolded under heavy supervision, routes chosen not for efficiency but for discretion, and Lydia watched landscapes change through narrow windows, towns slipping past without names, realizing that geography itself was being used as a tool of forgetting, and she wondered, with a detached curiosity that surprised her, how many others had traveled similar paths, how many brilliant, inconvenient lives had been quietly relocated into obscurity under the guise of care, and when they arrived, the new facility revealed itself not as a place of inquiry but of maintenance, designed to keep people contained rather than understood, and Lydia felt the finality of it settle over her like a closing door, because here there would be no professors wrestling with doubt, no debates about theory, only routine, only compliance, only the slow erosion of anything that drew attention. And yet even here, Lydia's mind did not surrender, because surrender is an act, and she refused to perform it, and instead she turned inward more completely than ever before, constructing elaborate mathematical worlds in her thoughts, revisiting proofs she had once solved aloud, extending them, refining them, not because anyone would ever hear them again, but because thinking itself had become her declaration of existence, and this inward life sustained her through days that otherwise blurred into sameness, through interactions that treated her as background rather than subject, and she learned to measure time not by calendars, but by the persistence of her own thoughts, by the fact that patterns still emerged unbidden, that logic still unfolded with elegance despite everything designed to dull it, and this persistence became both comfort and burden, because it reminded her constantly of what had been taken from her, of the world she might have entered. Had she been born into a different body, a different history, and as months passed, Lydia noticed that even within this place, she was becoming invisible, staff rotating without learning her story, her presence unremarkable, her file rarely opened, and invisibility, she realized, was the institution's final solution, because what is unseen cannot disrupt, and yet invisibility also offered a strange kind of freedom, because it loosened the grip of scrutiny, and Lydia used that looseness to protect what remained of herself, guarding her thoughts fiercely, refusing to let them atrophy, and she imagined a future audience, not of professors or judges, but of time itself, trusting that truth, even when buried, exerts pressure, that silence is not the same as erasure, and that one day someone might notice the gap where her story should have been. Early assessments archived without context, her transfer justified in language so vague it bordered on meaningless, and this bureaucratic thinning was the final act of violence, because it transformed a life into an abstraction, a problem solved by forgetting, and yet forgetting is never complete, because absences leave impressions, and Lydia sensed that truth even as she lived out her days unseen, because history has a way of circling back to what it has buried, and silence, when examined closely, reveals the shape of what was removed. And Lydia imagined a future far beyond her own lifetime, a future where someone would notice the gaps in the record, the abrupt end to a case that had once generated such urgency, and ask why. And that imagined question sustained her more than hope ever had, because hope depends on outcome, but truth depends only on existence, and Lydia's existence, however obscured, was undeniable, and in her quieter moments she reflected not only on her own fate, but on the countless others whose stories had followed similar paths, lives diverted into invisibility because they challenged narratives too useful to be surrendered. And she understood then that her story was not singular but part of a larger pattern, one in which brilliance emerging from the margins was met not with celebration, but with containment, study, and erasure. And this understanding did not diminish her pain, but it gave it meaning beyond herself, because it situated her suffering within a system rather than a failure. And as her health eventually declined, as age and isolation took their toll, Lydia faced the end not with fear but with a quiet resolve, because she had long since accepted that justice would not arrive in her lifetime. And acceptance, she learned, was not surrender but clarity, and in that clarity she held on to the knowledge that truth does not require recognition to be real, that her mind had been what it was regardless of whether it was acknowledged, and that the world's refusal to accept her brilliance was an indictment not of her, but of the structures that had needed her silenced. And when her presence finally faded completely from institutional records, when her name ceased to appear even as a number, the erasure was complete in the way systems measure completion. But history does not belong solely to systems. It belongs to memory, to storytelling, to the refusal to let silence stand as explanation. And that is where Lydia Johnson's story finds its true ending, not in disappearance but in retrieval, in the act of remembering what was deliberately forgotten, because every buried truth exerts pressure on the future, and eventually something gives. And the fact that you are hearing this story now, that you have traveled through its shadows and silences, is proof that erasure is never as final as those in power believe. And if Lydia Johnson's life unsettled you, if it made you question how many other minds were lost to fear disguised as science, then subscribe to the Black Timeline, hit the bell icon so you never miss these buried histories, and leave a comment sharing how deeply this story stayed with you, because remembrance is not passive, it is an act. And by remembering Lydia, by speaking her name, by refusing to let her brilliance remain a footnote, we push back against the silence that once swallowed her whole.